Welcome, friends, to another edition of Global Capitalism, a presentation brought to you by the Left Forum and Democracy at Work every other month. Today's presentation will be about the elections just concluded in the United States for president and won by Donald Trump. We're going to be talking about how that vote happened, why the election resulted in the way it did. We're going to then be talking about the new government and where it is likely to go. And then finally, we're going to be talking about the persistent problems of the United States. And we will explain why this election mostly ignored them. So let's begin with where the election begins, namely in the economic system of the United States. And before jumping in, I want to remind you that we recently released a book that I wrote called Understanding Capitalism, which would provide you with the background and the framework and the context for what is going on in the United States today, so that if you're interested in having the ideas that we present briefly today elaborated in many cases, then that's the book for you to get a hold of. It's available through our website, democracyatwork.info, and you'll find it there. To understand the election, you need to understand the political landscape. We have two political parties. The majority of Americans who voted had a choice only between those two. Yes, there were a few scattered third-party efforts, but they were missing in many states. They were not funded in anything like the monies that go to these two. In effect, the United States limits the political choice for president and for many, many of the other votes that are taken to two, the Democratic and Republican parties. This may be a country that celebrates the freedom of choice, but it severely limits the choice when it comes to elections and voting. And as a result of it being this way for many decades, there has been a division of labor agreed to by the two parties, as each of them does their share of the work in limiting the choice to two. What each party does is solicit donations from corporations and the rich, who provide the bulk of the donations of these two parties. The job of the two parties has then been never to question or to criticize the capitalist system that we live in as an economic system, and never to question or criticize the two-party system that our choices have been limited to. What each of the parties does is try to win the election. Each of them supports capitalism. They are literally cheerleaders for the capitalist system, never criticize it, never suggest alternatives. What's the need? And so each party to win has to get enough groups in the population, enough pieces of the mass of people, the working classes of the country, to vote for them. And the one who gets the most of these pieces of the public wins, and the one who doesn't loses. And they're very nice and polite to each other most of the time, because each understands that it could go this way or that way. Relatively few votes are decided without a pretty close total vote for the two candidates. It has lent itself over the years to being called the race between Tweedledum and Tweedledee. How did it work out this time? Well, we're going to begin with the winner, Donald Trump and the Republican Party. As usual, not a word of criticism of capitalism, not at all. Never, not even a hint. Cheerleading for the system all the way. So the question was, which groups can they get to vote for this position that they articulate? And I've divided the groups into the old groups that they kind of always get and some new groups. And the Republicans got enough new groups to win. First, the old groups, the religious Christians, particularly the evangelicals, the Pentecostals, and so on, some around the opposition to abortion, others just on the grounds that the Republican Party has been consistently the party that evangelical Christians mostly support. They feel close to them, and the Republican Party is constantly either symbolically or really doing for them. Second group, rural. Most of rural America tends toward the Republican Party. It's an old, established relationship. People who are in love with guns. Here in the United States, if you're not familiar, people can have guns, carry guns, buy guns, feel safer with guns, believe in guns. Guns have become symbolically important, and the Republican Party goes out of its way to cultivate gun lovers. Then there are those who are involved with the military. They are soldiers, or they work in industries that produce for the military, guns and planes and ships. The military is always part of their environment. It's what they depend on for jobs, typically. Strong in communities where the major employer is a military operation or a military industrial complex member, and they tend to vote Republican. And finally, the old game played by both parties was played this time by the Republican Party. The game goes like this. Whatever economic problem they are willing to talk about is blamed on the other party. So the Republicans blamed the Democrats. Was there an inflation? Yes. The Democrats did that. Was there a housing costs going up? Yes, the Democrats did that. Anything and everything you can think of that you can portray as bad is the fault of the other. And the Republicans did that. What new constituencies did the Republicans find to add to the old ones to produce their winning margin? Okay. By far the most important was to promote Donald Trump as something really new and different from the conventional political leadership. The American population has gotten used to, for at least 50 years, the alternation between Republicans and Democrats who don't differ by all that much on all the basic issues, who have a way of speaking and a way of presenting themselves, which by now has become associated in the minds of many, many Americans with what has happened to them over the last 40 years, which is a decline in the share of income going to workers, labor, as opposed to capital, stagnation of real wages. If you adjust for prices, real wages have virtually remained unchanged for the last 40 years. The whole normalcy of American political life was upended by Mr. Trump. He didn't speak in the same way. He was crude in a way that the usual politicians carefully avoid, at least in their public presentation. He made a big point of saying and acting how different he was. He wasn't part of the old established political class, as some call it. Okay? He also harped on problems faced by average people. He talked about inflation and people paying higher prices, which, of course, he blamed on the party in power, the Democrats, President Biden, and so on. But the two most remarkable things about Mr. Trump that, in my judgment, probably won him the margin needed for victory were the two walls he championed. A wall against the invasion of the immigrants. And number two, a wall against the invasion of Chinese goods into the United States. He railed against them over and over again. He is the champion who builds the wall, as he did in his first 4 years in office. He is the champion who waged trade and tariff wars against China in his first years. He will protect the American worker from the decline that is real and the suffering that is real over the last 30 and 40 years, and he will protect them with walls. It's a dramatic gesture. It's easy to understand. It makes a lot of sense. And attacking immigrants is blaming non-voting outsiders, foreigners. And attacking China is again blaming non-voting external foreigners. And that's an old tradition of blaming foreigners in the United States. And he did it dramatically, visited the wall, shook his fist at the Chinese, and so on. Okay, that was enough to win him the election. He did the usual protect and never question capitalism, cheerleading for capitalism. He had the old constituencies, and he had this new performance that won him a new constituency of all the working class that has suffered and wants a way out. And he promised them, as the protector on the great white horse, that he would protect them with walls. Let's contrast that with Kamala Harris. Her job, quite similar to Trump's. Take the money you get from big business and the wealthy, and now collect around you sections of the working class who will support you. Now, one thing the Democratic Party has, although it is less and less each year, is the residue of history. The history that comes out of the Great Depression 90 years ago, the 1930s, when a president did something for the mass of people no president since has come close to. The president established Social Security, passed the first minimum wage, passed the program to hire millions of unemployed people, and passed unemployment insurance. None of those had existed in the United States before. They came into being when the working class in the 1930s, in the Great Depression, rose up, demanded it from that president who was smart enough to give it to them. He was rewarded. And by the way, he paid for those expensive programs by taxing corporations and the rich. He was rewarded by being reelected president 3 times. Here's a fact of American history. The one president who really went after taxing corporations and the rich was the most popular president in the history of the United States. All of that leaves a residue. The Democratic Party can count on a certain percentage of the working class who votes Democratic every year out of a loyalty to and a feeling of solidarity with that history. The Democratic Party represents working people in a way that convention has the Republican Party representing the employer class. Who are the old constituencies of the Democratic Party who came through for Kamala Harris? The labor movement, the unions, social movements of most kinds, radicals, reformers, feel much closer to the Democratic Party. That, too, is a legacy of the Roosevelt history. Increasingly educated people, college graduates, people with advanced education, tend to vote Democrat, and they did this time, too. Urban and suburban, more than rural, go for the Democrats. And the new group for her, well, the abortion case won Kamala Harris the support of women who might otherwise have voted Republican. There's good evidence that that happened. She got a little bit about wanting to control prices. She said she wanted to, but she backed away and was unclear about how this would happen. She dared not. But perhaps the most important thing that was new was that against the bravado, the big story of the walls against the immigrants and the walls against the Chinese, Kamala Harris had nothing comparable. It's why a number of commentators have said that this election was an example of the rule you can't beat something with nothing. She didn't have a dramatic program comparable to, although hopefully different from, the dramatic wall building that Mr. Trump championed. So she didn't gather around her quite enough. Out of over 150 million votes cast, 2 or 3 million divide the two. So it was, as usual, reasonably close. Certainly not some overwhelming mandate, but of course the winning party tries afterwards to suggest that it was a mandate, an overwhelming. It wasn't. Not at all. Mr. Biden beat Trump 4 years ago by much more than Trump beat Kamala Harris this time. But that's how it happened. That's how it works. And in the end, when the dust clears, the Republicans in our system, a winner-take-all system, I want to remind everyone, we do not have the European system, which is called proportional representation. In Europe, the parliament, if, say, 10% of the people vote for the Socialist Party, then 10% of the members of parliament come from the Socialist Party. If 10% of your people want socialism, then the idea, democracy, is that 10% of the lawmakers should reflect that perspective, that preference of your people. If 30% want Christian democracy, then that's 30% of the seats. Here in the United States, we don't do that. We do it in some primaries, but we don't do it in the general election. In the general election, the one who gets 51% gets all the seats. And the one who gets less than 51, the 49, gets no seats. That's remarkable. How that is justified in the logic of democracy, I will leave to you, and you will discover that's very hard to do. But like freedom of choice, we articulate the idea and then bury it in practice in the American way. Well, let's turn then to the new government, the one being shaped now in that strange period of 2.5 months between the election and the inauguration of the new government. Okay. I want to focus, first of all, on what Mr. Trump has said, both during his campaign and in the days since the election, will be his economic program. First, he's going to hit the world with tariffs. That became his signature economic policy in his first 4 years. He clearly deems that to have been a success, and so he's going to do more of it in his second 4 years. And he threatens, and he has done this repeatedly, to impose new tariffs not just on the Chinese, but on everybody. For example, if you don't use the dollar the way you used to, you may be subject to a tariff in your country. America first being the motto, tariffs can be applied to everywhere, including the allies of the United States in Europe, who are furiously running around trying to figure out right now, as I speak to you, what tariffs are coming down and what they're going to do about it. Now, what about tariffs? Is this a reasonable policy? Well, it depends a little bit on what you mean by reasonable. A tariff is simply a tax. It's the name of a particular tax. To make it clear, it's the name of a tax on a specific thing, namely importing an object produced outside of the United States that is brought in and purchased by a citizen or a resident of the United States. If you bring it in, literally think of it as bringing something across the border into the United States, then you must pay a tax on that. And the tax is usually calculated based on the value of what you bring in. So, for example, a 10% tariff means that if you bring in something that costs $100, the importer, the American company or individual who brings it in, will have to pay not just $100 to the producer overseas who made it, but another $10, 10% of 100, go to Uncle Sam as a tariff, as a tax. In early American history, it was called an import duty. A tariff was called an import duty, but at least that made it clear it was a tax. And it should be made clear that the tax is paid by Americans to the American government. Mr. Trump, in order to make a big story about the wall against the Chinese, kept saying he was going to hit the Chinese with a tariff. It's not the Chinese who pay the tariff. It's Americans. Might have been clever to suggest to people who don't know what a tariff is that it was a weapon against China. It wasn't. Mr. Trump doesn't have the power to levy taxes in China. Not at all. Never did. He can only level that duty here. Now let's take a look if he did. It would mean, of course, that the price of everything goes up. As in my example, a $100 item coming into the United States might be sold for $100. But before anyone can buy it, it has to pay a tax, an import duty, a tariff, which means that the person who brings it in will have to sell it not at 100, but at least at 110 to recover the cost of the item and the tax that had to be paid. Long story short, tariffs are inflationary. But Mr. Trump is the great enemy of inflation. Yes, if you're the proponent of tariffs, and the enemy of inflation, you are in a contradiction. It's like saying you're in favor of X and you're against X, and smiling as you say those two contradictory things. Were Mr. Trump to go through with his tariffs, it would boost the inflation. And here's a little factoid for you. Almost everyone agrees that the inflation over the last 3 or 4 years was a major cause of the loss of the election, because it allowed Mr. Trump to say the inflation is bad and it's the fault of Mr. Biden. Don't vote Democratic if you're hurting from inflation. Everybody's hurting from inflation, except for the companies that raise their prices as much or more than the inflation, which they do in large numbers, which makes the inflation worse. A tariff raises prices. What is Mr. Trump going to do? Proceed with the tariffs he promised to impose, even if it hurts him politically by causing the inflation to get worse under his watch? You know what he's doing if he does that? He's setting himself up to be the victim of the blaming. Only in 3 and 4 years, it'll be Democrats blaming Trump and the Republicans, the way Trump and the Republicans just finished blaming Biden and the Democrats for the inflation of the last few years, which would be the normal, absurd back and forth that is American politics. So I can't be sure that Mr. Trump will go through with tariffs, nor can anyone else. And I can't be sure that the inflation will be at the level it is now or get much higher, and neither can anybody else. That's because Mr. Trump's tariff program is economically incoherent. It's a contradiction. It's saying something is true and false at the same time. But we're not done. Let's turn next to the other big wall, not the tariff wall, the wall against the immigrants. Now, here I have to say what some of you have heard me say before. Attacking immigrants is a cheap scapegoat. That's all that is. It demeans those who say and do it. Why do I say that? The United States is a quite rich country of 330 million people. According to Homeland Security Department, we have 10 to 12 million undocumented immigrants. There is no way, nor did Mr. Trump articulate in any way, how a tiny group of some of the poorest people on this planet would be the reason why a rich economy like the United States of 330 million people would be in any significant way affected by allowing 10 to 12 million undocumented immigrants into the country. The reason Mr. Trump never explained how that could work is because it's made up. You can't explain it. It isn't there. What Mr. Trump had to do is put together two unconnected things, both of which were false. One, that the immigrants are the cause of our economic difficulty. What are you talking about? They couldn't be. There aren't enough of them, and they're too poor. So he had to come up with something else. So he said, they bring crime. The FBI statistics are crystal clear. The percentage of immigrants committing crime is lower than the percentage of native-born Americans committing crimes. Nor should that surprise anyone. There's a mountain of literature that explains it. What? Immigrants are worried about something native-born don't have to worry about. If you get arrested as an immigrant, especially if you have no documents, you're going to get deported. Whatever other punishment is dumped on you, you're going to get thrown out. A native citizen doesn't have that worry. A native citizen, therefore, has less to worry about if they get caught than an undocumented immigrant who has to go out of their way not to have any brush with the law because it's so dangerous. More statistic. The immigrants bring in disease. Again, no data from the Center for Disease Control suggests that they are any sicker than the people inside the United States. Usually it's the other way around. Sick people don't migrate for a lot of reasons, including that they're sick. The people who risk the limits, the difficulties, the drought, the lack of food that an immigrant, particularly one coming up from Latin America, typically has, you have to be in pretty good health. It's usually relatively young people by the majority, children and elderly only a minority. So it's made up. It's incoherent. You deport those 10 to 12 million people, which is what Mr. Trump and his associates are claiming they're going to do. Here's the irony. Will it deal with the basic problems of the American economy? Not at all. Again, they're too few, they're too poor. Here's what you're going to do. You are going to deprive a significant number of employers in America of a chunk of their profits. And by the way, they're going to be very angry about that, and they're going to fight Mr. Trump. Who am I talking about? Construction employers who use undocumented immigrants, food producers in California and elsewhere who use undocumented immigrants to cultivate agrarian crops. And you know why they're employed there? Because an undocumented immigrant is the ideal employee for an employer who wants to rip off his workers. And you know why? Imagine with me a Friday afternoon at the construction site, and Jose arrives to pick up his envelope, his pay envelope, Friday afternoon, like all the other workers do. And they all get their envelope. And when the boss comes to Jose, he says, "I'm sorry, Jose, we ran out of money this week, but you come back next week, I think the chances are better." What is Jose going to do? Is this legal? Not at all. Is this being ripped off illegally by the employer? You bet. And what is the undocumented worker going to do? Answer, nothing. Because an undocumented worker keeps as far away from any government office as he can be. Because without documents, going into the government is going to risk being deported because you don't have the documents. And of course, the employers all know this. They hire undocumented workers because they can do almost anything to them. And I won't even go into the uglier parts of discrimination, sexual abuse, and all the rest. Honestly, speak with immigrants, you'll learn all about it. But of course, none of this matters to Mr. Trump because for them it's a convenient scapegoat. So he's going to deport them until the construction companies say, well, if we have to hire an American, we have to pay him much more than we could get away with paying an undocumented. Plus, we can't rip them off because they'll go to the police, they'll go to the Labor Department, and they'll complain if we violate, and they'll sue us. And whoa, we can't do that. And in agriculture, who's going to pick the lettuce and the apples and the tobacco leaf or anything else? It'll have to be non-undocumented immigrants, and they will have to be paid much more money. And there goes the price of food, because the people who have to pay those wages to those Americans will raise the price to cover what they have to raise in way of paying wages. You understand? Deporting millions of immigrants is inflationary, just like the war against foreigners with tariffs is inflationary. And inflationary is not going to make Mr. Trump popular, is it? It's more incoherent economic promises, incoherent economic program. Sounds he's protecting us. No, he's not. These are phantoms that he's protecting you against. Your problem, Mr. and Ms. America, is the capitalist system that neither of those two parties dares to confront or criticize or propose basic changes. No, no, no. Out of the question. Well, then how are you going to explain the problems? You blame the other party? How far does that get you? You make up a big, dramatic campaign. You hope that gets you something before people figure out, thinking about it, why it ain't going to work. And in case people don't, the employers that are badly affected will be screaming bloody murder. And they'll be looking to say to the Republican Party, right up to the president, you keep this up and we're going to support the other party to undo what you've done, just as you propose to undo what they did. There we are again, Tweedledum, Tweedledee. Extraordinary. Extraordinary. But I'm not done. What else is the new government going to do? Well, let's see. Arguing with our European allies, threatening them with tariffs. What's that going to do to the alliance, NATO, and the friendship, theoretically, between Europe and the United States? Well, if Mr. Trump gets us out of the Ukraine war quagmire, as he has said he will do, in one day he said he could do it. If he does it, then the Europeans are going to have to make a terrible, difficult decision. And they're going to hate the Americans for forcing it. If the Americans don't support Mr. Zelensky and the war in Ukraine, then the only way it can go on, since the Ukrainian economy is finished, the Ukrainian military exhausted and defeated, the only way to keep that going is with massive infusions of money. Mr. Trump made it clear he's not going to do that. That means the Europeans, the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, they're going to have to decide to tax their people hugely and not to provide them with services, but instead to turn that money over to Ukraine to make up for what the United States isn't going to give them anymore. You want to put a strain on your alliance? That's a way to do it. You want to blow NATO up? That's the way to do it. The United States was one of the major pushers of supporting Ukraine and one of the major funders and one of the major weapons suppliers. Backing away, which is the Trump proposal, forces the Europeans. And unlike the United States, in European elections, there are almost always more than two parties. They don't talk much about freedom of choice, but they offer it to their people in a way we don't in the United States. So there's coming enormous frictions with Europe. Now, we don't hear about that much in the American press, but I read French and German newspapers every day, and I can assure you, it's right at the forefront of what they're worried sick about, and they're angry that they're being put in this situation. And the mass of their people are letting the politicians know, we're not going to pay large new taxes while you pour that money down the rabbit hole of Ukraine. We don't want it. And in Europe, you can't ignore what your people say in the way we do here in the US of A. So there are political problems with the incoherence of Mr. Trump's economic program. Let me give you another one. The United States now has a serious economic competitor. For the first time in a century, we have a serious economic competitor, the People's Republic of China, that has gathered around itself close economic allies, first numbering 4 other countries, then 6 more to make 10, and then most recently 13 more to make 23 countries comprising the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S, the alliance around China. You put those countries together, their population is many times larger than that of the United States. Their total output of goods and services is also larger, not only than that of the United States, but of the United States and its 6 major allies: Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, the so-called G7. And so it turns out that the United States' plans to hit everybody with tariff, you know what the reaction is going to be? That the BRICS countries, which include China, but also Russia and India and Saudi Arabia and many other countries, they're going to come closer together to form a common united front against the United States. That is a political transformation of the world economy. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. But it shows you we are not going to be free to do what we want in the way we got used to in the second half of the 20th century. The empire of the United States is declining, and the empire of the Chinese is rising. Every empire that the world has seen has risen, evolved over time, and passed away. The United States empire rose at the end of the 19th century, evolved across the 20th, and commenced its decline in this century, now 24 years old. Nothing that Mr. Trump said, and nothing that Kamala Harris said, admitted or faced or analyzed or proposed how to deal with this decline. That's astonishing. I will come back to that. Now, there will be other problems that this new government will face. It's Mr. Trump's second term. You're only allowed 2 terms under the existing law in the United States. And with a close election, it would be difficult for Mr. Trump to change the law to allow him more than 1 more term, which means everyone knows already now, before he takes office, that this is his last time in office. Every one of the Republican leaders who now back him is busily maneuvering to be whoever comes after Trump for the Republican Party. That promises internal intrigue, internal maneuver, internal betrayal that should be quite something to watch in the 4 years coming. All right. So much for how the vote happened and what we can expect from the new government. And I'm not even going to go into the fashionable, popular game of criticizing the particular appointments Trump has already made. Some of them are outlandish. They are dramatically unusual, different characters, just like he was. It worked for him. He's selecting people like that. Others are quite conventional and represent what you would expect of a Republican Party that's closer to the employer class to do in terms of who it empowers to run the society. Will the basic problems of the American masses who voted for Mr. Trump, will they be solved? Will they be fixed? Will they be glad 1, 2, 3 years from now that they voted for Mr. Trump? Well, to the extent that their views are shaped by economics, the answer to me is clearly no, not a chance. If their views can be shaped by other events, abolishing abortion rights nationwide, which is something he may do, closing down civil liberties and civil rights, something he may do, that may win him a certain amount of support. But if it comes to economics, no. No, he won't win anything there because his program, insofar as we can see it, is incoherent, so we can't be sure what he's going to do. But I'm confident that he will fail either way. If he does the tariffs, he'll be hurt by the inflation. If he avoids the inflation, he'll be hurt by having gone back on the promise around the tariffs. The same thing with immigration. But my confidence that he will not be praised and not be voted for again on the grounds of economics comes from one single obvious fact. The basic economic problems of the United States were not addressed by Mr. Trump, nor by Kamala Harris. They both did their job by keeping the basic problems of capitalism off the conversation, off the table, out of contention, never debated. Let me give you 3 examples. Number 1, the enormous, extreme inequality of wealth and income in the United States. Before World War II, the United States, or during World War II, or at the end of World War II, around that time, mid-century of the last century, the United States was a less unequal country than most of the old European countries. Today, the United States is more unequal than any country in Europe, even England, which is second. What's going on? We have allowed the people at the top 1 to 10%, to take all of the economic growth of the last 75 years into their own hands. The real wages of Americans stagnated. Before now, most American families did not rely on massive amounts of debt in their daily lives. Today, most Americans are deeply in debt. Their worries about income and a job are now discovering that they have the added worry about levels of debt they cannot manage. The way the American working class avoided the decline in its standard of living for most of the last 30 to 40 years has been by going into debt. That and sending out more members of the household to work. above all, women. Women, particularly white women, could have imagined in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s being a housewife, a homemaker, a mother. She didn't have to go out to work in the cases of millions of American families. That's over and gone. To sustain most American families, all the adults, even the teenagers, have to work on weekends, on afternoons, during the day, whatever they can. Family life disrupted and deeply compromised over the last 30 to 40 years, as the woman who used to hold the house together is out there working and coming home as tired and depleted as the men. The bitterness of the men whose wages have gone nowhere, that they now depend on the wife earning, the anger, the lack of preparation, the hostility towards women that men exhibit, all has its grounding in a change in the economy. Jobs that went abroad. And let's not blame the Chinese, since it's transparently scapegoating. The Chinese didn't decide to close the factory in Cincinnati and move it to Shanghai. American corporate leaders made those decisions. They're the ones, and only them, who decided to close the factory in New Jersey and open it in Wuhan, who decided to expand production over there rather than over here, to lay off workers here and hire them over there. The Chinese didn't do that. American corporate leaders did it. And we know why, because they told us. It's more profitable. That's why. The wages are lower in China, and China, 4 times the size of the United States, is the world's biggest growing market. And we learned in business school, didn't we, that if you want to succeed in business, go to where the wages are low and the market is expanding. And that place is called China. And they went, and they didn't care what they left behind. Families who couldn't get the kinds of jobs that were once available in American factories. Good union jobs with lots of benefits for workers were gone. You have to give that up. But you can be a greeter at Walmart. Won't pay you anything, but you'll be able to say you got a job. We're a country of service workers now. Most of our manufacturing is gone. Blaming immigrants is silly. They had nothing to do with that decision. Immigrants are coming here for work. They're not the problem of moving jobs, nor are the Chinese. They welcomed it because they like to have investment in their country. Who's surprised by that? They welcomed the American company to hire Chinese, to produce and sell in China, as so many of them now do. Blaming the Chinese is simply an attempt to fool the American people, to put the blame for what capitalists chose to do onto somebody else, like an immigrant, poor as they are, like the Chinese waiting for Americans to decide or not to bring their business there. When Mr. Trump gives speeches about bringing manufacturing jobs back to America, does he appeal to the Chinese to do that? Of course not. He knows they won't. He's appealing to American corporate. He knows where the decision lies. Appealing to them, he'll do. Criticizing them, never. Even in his first race for president, he did on occasion say something critical, not about capitalism, of course not, and not about corporate life and corporate structures, of course not. But he did criticize some of them for moving their production out of the country. This time, he didn't even dare do that. But he beat up on the Chinese and he beat up on the immigrants. Big, bold man scapegoating people who are not relevant because he can't dare criticize those who are. You know how I would characterize the failure of this election and the failure of this electoral system and the failure of the United States in this moment? I would characterize it by what the psychologists call denial. The United States is denying what it is and what's happening to it. When I said to you a few moments ago that I will be coming back to the topic, here's the topic I'm coming back to: the decline of the American empire. Over the last century, Britain has had to come to terms with the end of the British Empire. It's been long, hard, and slow. Corporations and the rich left England and moved elsewhere. Corporations and the rich held on to their privileges inside England, which meant that the end of the empire impacted most and worst on the middle and lower classes in England. And that's what's going on in the United States, too. Corporations and the rich are holding on to what they got, their privileges, their disproportionate wealth. And for the rest of us, it's becoming harder and harder. That's why the inflation was so bitterly resented. That's why the government's tax raising on us is so bitterly resented. We all feel it, this imposing the decline of the empire on us. Yeah, we'd like to pretend we can go out and fight the Russians in Ukraine, but that war is being lost. Like the war in Vietnam was lost, and the war in Afghanistan was lost, and the war in Iraq was lost. You know, in a country that wasn't busily lost in denial, 4 wars with 4 defeats would occasion a serious debate. What is wrong? Why did we lose? Are we making some grand strategic error? Should we question or change our policy? A healthy society, not lost in denial, would ask that question. This is crucial. We just went through a national election selecting our president, and there wasn't one word about the basic inequality of this system. You're not going to change that by not taxing tip income or giving first-time homeowners a $25,000 boost in their down payment. Are those nice ideas? Sure they are. But they're details around the edges. They don't deal with the fundamental problem of our capitalist system, that it produces such extreme inequality. Here's the second example of denial. We live in an unstable economy. What do I mean? Well, this year we're worried about an inflation. Next year we're worried about a recession. The economy bounces back and forth. Too much unemployment, too much price increases. The Federal Reserve, our monetary system, was set up over a century ago with 2 charges: maintain full employment, and maintain price stability. It failed. We continuously have one or the other, sometimes even both. It's called stagflation. The Federal Reserve can't do what it was set up to do. That's a real problem. But our candidates, Harris, Trump, they don't deal with that. They don't question the instability. If you lived with a person as unstable as capitalism, you probably would have moved out long ago. But we live in a society that responds to these profound problems, extreme inequality and instability, by denying them, by acting as if they weren't there, by acting as if little details that we talk about are adequate to deal with these problems. We've never done anything seriously about them. That's why it is as true today to talk about inequality and instability as it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and 150 years ago, because nothing substantive has been done about it. That's the failure of American politics and of this election. Let me return finally to the issue of that declining empire. How are we going to deal with that declining empire? Are we going to admit that it's happening? You know, the way an alcoholic is asked by Alcoholics Anonymous to begin a conversation by saying, I am an alcoholic. Because they've learned if you don't admit the problem you have, the chances of your solving it are very poor. So this country has to admit it has a problem with extreme inequality. Elon Musk has 250 or more billions of dollars, enough money to solve all by himself several of the major problems of the American economy. He does nothing of the sort, nor do we require it of him. Meanwhile, we have millions of Americans who don't get enough food of the proper sort, who can't afford organic food, who have to eat processed food, which hurts them and cuts their lives short. We allow inequality to beset us at every turn. The quality of our housing, the quality of our clothing, the quality of our education, the quality of our health care. Inequality dogs us. So does the instability of our economy. The business cycles, they want us to call them. Instability is what it is. What do you do about a declining empire? Fight more wars? We've been doing a lot of wars. Mr. Trump is right to say he wants to stop the forever war. But he imagines that those wars are something he could just stop doing. How charming. How charming. You stop a war, you have to rearrange your society, which now depends on war. The single most powerful and profitable industrial group in our country is called the military-industrial complex. Ask yourself why they have become so powerful, so rich, so profitable, and why no one has dared question this for 75 years in any kind of systematic way. And the few individuals who did were politically demoted right out of relevance, from Dennis Kucinich to Bernie Sanders to all the others. No. To deal with a declining empire, you have to admit that it's happening. And I'm going to give you an example to close out that I have given in many talks, but it bears repeating. The British tried to hold on to their empire in North America in 1774, 5, and 6, and again in 1812. They fought 2 wars, and they lost those wars. Just like the United States fought the wars in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and now through a proxy in Ukraine, and it lost them all. The British, at least, after losing the U.S. War of Independence and then again the War of 1812, realized that they were not going to be able to hold on to their empire in North America. They better come to terms with it. And they did. No more wars. Not only that, you in America, you can have Latin America as your colonial playground. We are going to focus on Asia, Africa, and so on. A deal was struck. I'm not advocating it. I am not excusing it. A deal was struck because war then was no longer an acceptable price to pay. Well, what are we doing? We are fighting wars. And with the decision made yesterday to allow Ukraine to send missiles deep into Russia, we are threatening nuclear war. The war between the United States and Britain back in the 19th century, there were no nuclear weapons, but we have them now. And somebody is likely to use them, especially once the United States did at the end of World War II. What a strange place we have come to. When the latest of the empires to pass its peak and start its decline is implicitly threatening the world with wars, including nuclear wars, rather than stop denying and face the fact that we too need to sit down and negotiate, above all, with the Chinese and the BRICS, how we're going to manage in a peaceful way the decline of the latest empire, and perhaps associate that with an effort leaning on the Chinese to see whether they might be willing to learn from history and not set up the next empire, which would be a Chinese empire, only to see it eventually peak and start to decline too. They can see the dangers represented by the way the United States is mishandling through denial and war the decline of its empire. Yeah, the decline of empire is the issue. It stalked this election by its absence. Its absence from the discussion didn't do anything to make it go away as a problem. In fact, here we are, a few days after the election, and the United States is closer to war with Russia than we were throughout the Cold War. We haven't solved anything. We've made it all worse. Denial is not a way of solving a problem. Some of you have wondered and asked me, how exactly does the denial of a declining empire work? And I don't have the time to do it in detail, but I wanted to sketch the answer as my closing comments on this election. When the empire declines, when our exports are no longer as important to the world as they once were, when our imports are not as important to the countries from which we import as they once were, when the universal currency that everybody uses is less and less the US dollar and more the Chinese yuan and many other local currencies. When we see the relative shrinkage of the US footprint in the world economy, how does it show up at home? Well, we have less wealth coming in. We have less wealth accumulating here. There's more wealth produced over there. There's more wealth leaving here for over there because of that. With less to go around, who is made to suffer here at home? Well, let me give you some examples. The grossest one, but yet it tells the story so well, is the story of the minimum wage in the United States. Federal minimum wage, last raised by the U.S. Congress, which has that authority, in the year 2009, 15 years ago. It was raised to the lofty level of $7.25 per hour, which you cannot live on in this country. It hasn't been raised. In every one of the last 15 years, prices rose in this country. Sometimes they only rose 1 or 2%. Sometimes they rose as much as 7, 8, or 9% in a year. But throughout every one of those 15 years that the prices got higher, the amount of money we paid to the lowest paid workers in our community, those living on the minimum wage, was $7.25, which could buy less and less each year as prices rose. What kind of a country would single out the poorest workers and treat them in so savage a way? Answer: our country. By denying that we are in a declining empire, that perhaps to get through it, we might all sacrifice something. No. We're organizing the sacrifices so that they hurt those with the least capacity to cope with them, which is perverse. Here's another example. Social Security benefits have not kept pace with inflation, just like the minimum wage didn't. That whacks the elderly. I'm not done. One of the reasons the inflation was so bitter an experience is because of what is not understood about inflation, but needs to be. Inflation simply means a general rising of prices. Let me remind those of you who may have lost sight of this reality. Prices are set by employers. According to the U.S. Census, 3% of our people in this country are employers. The other 97% aren't. 3% of the people set the prices. They decide whether the price goes up, goes down, or stays the same. The rest of us, the 97%, pay what the 3% do. If we have an inflation, it's because the 3% have decided to raise prices. They have that right. They have that position. They have that privilege. We get to pay. Well, you can ask them, why do you raise prices? And their answer will be, as it is given in every business school, what you do as an employer with your prices is driven by your goal, which is to maximize the profits of your business. In simple English, you raise prices when it is profitable to do so. You know that when you raise prices, some people, the poorest, won't be able to afford it anymore. So you'll lose some business. And you weigh that, that's a cost, against the fact that if you raise prices, all the people who keep on buying what you're selling will give you more money for it. That's what raising prices means. So you weigh those two. If the latter is bigger than the former, you go ahead and do it. And they all did it. That's why we all paid more for eggs and sugar and milk and everything else. It's a ripoff of the masses by those at the top. And that's how they handle the decline of empire. By denying that it's happening, but then by acting on it, by offloading the burdens and costs of a declining empire onto the middle and lower classes in their society. Britain has been doing it for a century. History will ask, does the United States do it that way too? Or is there enough of a commitment to political and economic change to not go that sorry route? And that's the question this election didn't ask and didn't answer, because denial turned out to be all it could do or say. And that bespeaks the bankruptcy of this political system. It's not adequate to the real problems American capitalism faces. For that to happen, you need a whole change in your politics, starting with ending the convenient monopoly of the two parties that make sure we have no other choices. Yeah, we need to have a new political party, maybe more than one, so that we can begin to hear arguments that are not based on denial, that are not incoherent, and that can lead us to a better outcome than this tired, exhausted capitalism is capable of doing. Thank you all for your attention. I look forward to speaking with you again in January when we meet again, and when it is my hope we will be resuming live presentations of this monthly, every other month program. But we will let you know in plenty of time for the January meeting. Thank you.